All right, good morning, everybody. Hope y'all had a good break. The end is so near. So last chapter, we've got 20 or so slides to cover. My intentions are to wrap this stuff up next week. We won't have lecture. Should be just time for you guys to review. I will get the exam put together. It is cumulative. There will be, I haven't built it yet, but there will be a good chunk of questions, maybe close to half of the stuff that covers the new stuff. And then about half or so that will be hopefully review stuff from the previous units of material. So yes, sir. Yes. So it should be hopefully should be smooth sailing. It will be like all of the finals, more time. There will be some more questions on there as well. I will give you details about that stuff as soon as I get it put together. Then you'll have at least a little bit of an idea how many questions and whatever. So any other questions? Okay. So the last bit of stuff, we want to think about conservation and biodiversity. We want to think about a little bit about human impact and how some of our actions are shaping and impacting diversity. So there are that's odd. Somehow I've got blue. That's okay. There are all sorts of ideas when we think about our potential impacts, and it really, as we think about human population and our surging growth, it's pretty obvious that our impact on the environment is going to leave a mark. So there are definitely issues dependent upon where you're at, where those marks might be more visible. And in areas like tropical rainforests that should be lush with vegetation, these are pretty apparent when we can see human encroachment into these areas, deforestation, whether it be for growing crops, raising livestock, or human habitation. Oftentimes it's a mixture of the three that we see in these situations. We talked before the break a little bit about some of these issues when we think about some tropical areas and through the process of trying to use these areas for agriculture where it seems like it should be, you know, lush and nutrient rich. Those soils really have a very rapid turnover with those nutrients, and it ultimately lends to greater encroachment into these areas as we have to clear cut more to get soils that still have nutrients that are usable, and that lends to bigger issues as we see more and more deforestation. We are also witnessing in areas like the Amazon, as we've got it right up here, issues with droughts. This is a rainforest. We shouldn't be thinking about lacking moisture, but there are problems. And we're seeing with the changing climates, levels of precipitation being altered in these types of areas, lending to more dry conditions. And it sets the stage for fires and bigger impacts. Typically, in a functional, healthy rainforest, fires aren't something that we think of as an issue, not something that we think of as a potential, because the amount of moisture that is trapped within this ecosystem is preventing that. We have witnessed in the Amazon a couple of big events over the past decade, two severe droughts that they call 100-year droughts. But they've basically been a couple of years apart, back to back, not a century in between. And that definitely raises some, or should raise, some alarms as we think about these potentials. So we'll see some more as we move through. Shifting over to Madagascar, we can see this area, something that we will see maybe toward the tail end when we talk about some of these hot spots. It is a high biodiversity habitat. It is one that's recognized as a hotspot, an area that is of extreme importance and concern, something that, you know, we would like to say, well, we should protect everything. And, you know, deep down, when we try to think about these things, I mean, obviously, that's a huge task. So instead of trying to conserve diversity across the globe, we think about specific regions that are rich with diversity and, you know, spend more of a focus and money on trying to conserve and preserve these types of habitats with the hopes that it will have a bigger umbrella once we start thinking about increasing protection. So there, within these types of habitats that are rich with diversity, oftentimes we think areas that are, you know, close to the equator that have greater amounts, as we've discussed before, greater amounts of energy from the sun, greater amounts of productivity with plants, and more resources for animals to tap into, right? So that has lots of diversity, lots of variation. And we showed images with different types of biomes and deserts versus tropical regions and the types of plants and animals you might expect to see in these different types of biomes are varied. So even though we see high diversity, there is massive issues with destruction and human encroachment, where only a small fraction of the lowland forests remain. And so a lot of the diversity that was once found in these areas has gone away. Almost half is potentially lost. That begs the question, in all of these differing types of habitats, as diversity starts to decline, what sorts of things are we losing? Are things driving toward extinction? Are there species that only call these specific habitats home? And if they are lost, when you're extinct, that's the end, right? What sorts of potentials could these things have in their habitats? We talked about keystone species, and we'll show some more of that in a bit. As far as their potentials to help these specific types of habitats to be healthy. There are other ideas, and we'll see some of this, some of it coming from Madagascar, when we think about bioprospecting. And I talked about some of that stuff before the break as well. When we think about tapping into some of the natural resources, to think about substances that may be found or isolated in plants or animals that may have some sort of properties that could be, beneficial to us or to other things. But oftentimes we think about ourselves. So as we lose diversity, we also think about the potential for some of those properties that may hold potentials for humanity to also be lost. So it really depends, and this another image, it could be back before the break when we were looking at the different biomes. As we think about the different types of ecosystems and variation between aquatic and terrestrial types of habitats, but the diversities that we can see in these regions are varied as well. I was already kind of hitting on that as we started. So it truly depends on the circumstances and, well, really what we're trying to evaluate as we examine these ecosystems in the first place. So this image shows a number of amphibians, global perspective, and it's similar to what I've said repeatedly. As we get toward the equator, we see greater amounts of diversity. So in this case, we're focusing on amphibians, but we already showed lots of the tropical regions within this area. These habitats are the perfect types of an environment for amphibians. So we see, in the reddish color here toward the equator or very near that, the greatest amount of amphibian species, the greatest variety. So increased biodiversity, more numbers, more variation. And as we get farther away, as we move to, more northern or southern latitudes, farther away from the equator, the levels of these amphibian species drop dramatically, right? We also think about other things as we look at amphibians and think of them as maybe an indicator species for environmental health. And as we look at declining populations, it is an indication that there are issues with the environment that are setting the stage for it to not be as hospitable as it once was. And that can be the result of habitat destruction, agriculture and pesticide and herbicide that potentially lends to pollutants that impacts amphibian species and others. But they are potentially some of the first things that we see those impacts with, right? Sometimes they describe the amphibians like the canary in the coal mine. And if you don't know what that means, way back in the day, coal miners deep down in the earth, as you're digging these mines, the potential to run out of oxygen is an issue. And a canary is much more sensitive to those levels. And so the miners would have a little canary. There would be a lantern by this canary and they'd be watching it. And if they look up and the canary is dead in the cage, you better get the hell out of the mine. You're gonna be dead right after, right? So an indicator, right? A warning. And that definitely can maybe make some eyes open up and say, wait a minute, what impact do we truly have on this habitat? So I told you we'd come back to Madagascar. This plant, Madagascar periwinkle, has a handful of medicinal properties. One of them is vincristine. I think there's another one called vinblastine, if I remember right, something like that. This drug, the vincristine, is a drug that's utilized in the treatment of lymphomas. There are all sorts of other examples where we can look at plants and other things, but plants hold lots of pharmacological properties where we can tap into these things. And as I was saying a second ago, when we start thinking about habitat destruction and loss of diversity, the potential to lose something like this before we've ever even recognized what sorts of possibilities it might hold, lends to situations where things go undetected. Potential cures for cancers or other ailments may be lost. And that is, at least from my perspective, unfortunate. This image, I am impressed by it. I'm also a little disturbed because a lot of this glacier is in the process of receding. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault is a potential, and there are other seed banks, but this one aims to harness and catalog the Earth's biodiversity, taking seeds and basically saving them away so that that diversity is protected. And there are all sorts of ideas with seed banks where we've got, over the course of a very long time, different types of plants where those seeds have been saved. So some things that potentially could hold maybe drought tolerance or insect resistance or other things like that potentially could be tapped into. And in a climate that is shifting, there are potentials that maybe some of these could hold some promise, some benefit. So we hope that situations like this are able to preserve and maintain some of this diversity in the first place. So I think this figure is a little bit disturbing. It's something that, without really knowing about concentrations of things, all sorts of chemistry stuff, it's kind of hard to really understand what's going on, right? But as we look at it, we can definitely see that at present day, these levels of carbon dioxide are considerably greater, about 100 parts per million greater really than they ever have over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. How do we know this? Ultimately, to look at some of this, and we're looking at atmospheric carbon dioxide, but in order to evaluate that thousands of years, they drill big cores of ice in Antarctica where they can drill down and get thousands of years back in time and look at the carbon dioxide that's dissolved within the ice and ultimately make measurements to gauge levels of CO2. That's how we are seeing these levels here and fluctuations. There definitely are alterations in the levels, but peaking at about 300 or so, right? Right around there. And then declining. So we do see these fluctuations, but the issue as we get, closer to present day, these levels have gone up considerably, and really with industrial revolution, the burning of fossil fuels has led to excessive amounts of carbon dioxide being added to the atmosphere. And that is the spike, these greenhouse gases, and really CO2 is just one of the greenhouse gases that lends to warming of the planet and drives change. Technically, as I'm pointing at my greenhouse gas, we need the greenhouse effect in order to trap heat to keep this planet warm and hospitable. But as these gases accumulate, it lends to a thicker layer that traps more of the heat and basically turns that thermostat up. That's an issue. So the thoughts as we look at this are really, what can we do to help reduce and just maybe start to bring down these levels back to what we might say are normal levels. And that's a good question. As we look at this seems to be something that looks like a lush habitat, but really this is a type of monoculture. At least all of this. These are probably weeds. So all of this, these are oil palm plantations, and basically the habitat has been changed, where all of the diverse vegetation has been removed, and the palm planted in its stead. And in these circumstances, although it looks like a sea of green, as I said 1 second ago, it's all the same stuff. It's a monoculture. It's like, Southeast Idaho, and you look at the fields and it's potato field after potato field. A lot of the exact same potatoes, right? At least here now in Idaho, it's not all russet potatoes. They grow different types of potatoes, but it's still lots of potatoes, all right? And some potential issues with the monoculture is if there's some sort of pest or disease that targets this type of crop, if it's only that one variety or that one strain that is growing there, the potential for it to get decimated is huge. That's one problem, right? The Irish potato famine's a pretty good example of that. A lot of the organisms in this habitat depended upon other types of plants, other vegetation. And with it gone, it changes the diversity. It changes that probably for the worse. This, I think, is a great story. I should have cracked the text just to see what they have to say for sure, because I'm pretty sure it wasn't accidental. But I'm not 100% with that. All right. So the brown tree snake is an exotic, maybe we could say an invasive species. This snake was introduced to the island of Guam. As far as I recall, there were no snakes. All right. This is an issue. All right. So Guam is a military base. That's the bulk of the problems here, right? And with the military comes some potential waste, right? There's all sorts of trash. There's all sorts of issues. And in turn, with that comes rodents. With people encroaching into habitats comes rodents as well. Rats wind up on this island, and with all of the garbage, they have a heyday. We've got mass quantities of rats, right? And this accidental, I don't know. From what I had heard before, the military brought these snakes in. Somebody thought, who eats rats? Snakes eat rats, right? So it seems like a great idea to bring some snakes to this island, and they'll cure our rat problem, right? This sucker's a tree snake. Rats don't live in trees. Birds live in trees, right? The brown tree snake doesn't eat rats. It eats birds. It eats bird eggs and maybe baby birds too. That's what it wants to eat, all right? Not rats. So the potential solution that was accidentally introduced became a huge problem. It's still a huge problem. right? The rats didn't go away. These snakes probably never ate a rat, right? Why would you? There's birds all over the place. They crawl up into the trees and in turn have all sorts of stuff on their menu. Issues with this also, I just said a second ago, there weren't any snakes on this island. The birds don't know anything about this. They don't know anything about this new predator that has just been introduced. And in turn, their populations have plummeted. We have seen numerous extinctions, and these extinctions are bird species that the tree snake is feeding upon. Awesome. Oftentimes, when we think about some mechanism to control something, and it's usually us that has this brilliant idea that we can fix this problem that we created, we see it causing bigger problems. It blows up in our face, right? There are other examples where we have tried to do something, some sort of biological control, right? Where you take some animal and try to use it to combat some other animal, right? There can be some other examples too with plants and whatever, but usually it's something like that. I've got one more example. I think there's a picture of a frog next. This is different, but I want to talk, as we've got it up here, about Australia. And there are some toads, cane toads, that were introduced to Australia. And it's a similar issue, a similar problem, like the tree snake. In Australia, there are some regions that are pretty good for growing sugarcane. There is a type of beetle that gets in and feeds on the sugarcane, a cane beetle. It causes big problems and economic losses. So they see this toad called a cane toad. With a name like cane toad, you would think it should be perfect for sugarcane, and it should feed on these cane beetles, right? That's how it seems, but that's not what it does, right? And the cane beetle is higher up in the sugarcane. The cane toad does nothing to the cane beetle. The cane toad is poisonous, and it feeds on all sorts of other amphibians, decimating the natural populations of Australia's amphibians and becoming the dominant invasive species, right? Probably just like the tree snake that never ate a rat, the cane toad probably has never eaten a cane beetle, right? Their populations have surged out of proportions, massive amounts of cane toads, right? With huge, huge populations of these toads. There are images, you can YouTube some of this stuff up if you are interested, where you can see toads. As far as you can see are toads. The entire road is covered with toads and people just drive over them. That's a way to control them, just run them over. It causes problems, however, with all of these toads getting squashed on the roads. It causes a black ice, like wintertime around here. It's a toad slick. And the roads are super, super greasy with toads, and it causes accidents. Crazy. This problem has blown up, all right? So, issues. That's not this, but we've got our little frog here, so it seemed like a good point to talk about it, since we were just mentioning the tree snake. So, there are other issues with exotic or invasive species that get introduced, and we see problems as well. And we talked a little bit about some of that before the break. So, excuse me, in this case, this poor little frog here, it has died from a fungal infection, chytridiomycosis, and it causes some of these reddish lesions on there. This fungus is highly infectious or contagious to frogs, easily transmitted from one frog to the next, and we can see big issues with this. So And as it impacts things that are endangered, it sets the stage for bigger problems, bigger concerns with them for sure. So kind of crazy. This, not the same, but another type of fungus. So this little brown bat, and there's all sorts of bat species, but the little brown bats, and I think maybe the big brown bats as well, but the little ones definitely have had a huge issue with this infection, right? And they call it white nose syndrome. They ultimately didn't really know what was going on, right? And this is really pretty new when we start thinking about these issues and recognizing this as a problem, right? There was a researcher, I can't remember exactly where he was at, somewhere back east, right? And he studied bats. And there was a different textbook that I was using a handful of years back that used this as a story and used it as kind of the very start of the semester to think about how do you do an experiment, how do you formulate a hypothesis, all sorts of different things, and collecting data, right? So these bats that this researcher has been studying, he would go to these caves, a handful of different caves in the spring. Every year they would go and they'd do surveys, they'd capture some bats, they'd make measurements, they do all sorts of stuff, biology, right? Just trying to understand the bat, right? This year, when at 2009, the researcher is in the process of writing a grant and is basically stuck in the lab. He doesn't have time to go to the field site. So a handful of his graduate students go to the field site to make these measurements. When they show up at this cave, and I don't, it's probably not the same spot, they show up to this area where these bats winter. So you get a whole big, I don't know what you call a group of bats, big colony of bats wintering, hibernating in these caves or mines, right? And in these circumstances, it's really kind of the perfect environment. The temperatures don't really fluctuate that much. So it's nice habitat for them to winter, right? Or to just flat out live it, right? So they show up to these caves and it's multiple ones that they go to. And when they walk in, the whole floor of the cave is littered with dead bats. And they see all of these bats and they see this white crap all over their faces. And they start wondering what's happening, right? Some of the first thoughts, when something dies, mold is going to get all over it, right? You're going to start to decay. You're going to start, the detritivores are going to recycle you back into the environment. So their first thoughts when they see this, they don't think anything of it, all right? That's just part of the decomposition process. What's killing these bats? That's what they want to know. So they're getting a hold of the PI, the investigator, right? The professor that's back in the lab trying to write a grant. They get a hold of him and tell him, there's bats all over the place that are dead. You would expect a few of them to not make it through the winter, right? Some of them are going to die, but not hundreds or thousands of them dead on the floor of the cave, right? It was alarming. So he shows up shortly after, right? A few days, hurries and finishes the grant. He shows up to evaluate this, to see it, right? And it's pretty interesting because initially there's pictures of the students in this cave, and they're in there just normal, right? No masks, no, they got gloves on. But they aren't wearing masks. They're not concerned about that stuff. And the next picture, they're all like hazmat suits, respirators. They got all, because they don't know what the hell's going on, right? How is it that all of these things have died, right? So there's numerous things that they start thinking about, right? And again, as I just said, that fungus they're thinking that's just secondary, right? That's just part of the, it's the decomposition process. A few start wondering, maybe it is this fungus, right? That's causing these problems, right? So more and more studies start going on. They collect the fungus from the nose, they cultivate it, so they grow it up in the lab, and then they're able to take that stuff that they've grown up and inoculate it or put it onto a bat and see that bat develop the disease and ultimately die. That process of showing this progression of disease is kind of a classical technique to trace some infectious agent and show that it's really the culprit, right? So they do this and show that this fungus is able to be grown in a lab and it's able to cause a similar infection. There's a lot to the story that I'm skipping over. Part of it was the cave. And initially, when we think about like microbiology stuff, we think about trying to grow things at our body temperatures or potentially maybe at room temperature. Those are usually what we think about, right? And that's what they were doing with this fungus. And it's not growing, right? They're not getting it to be able to cultivate. And another researcher started thinking a little bit about it. And he's like, wait a minute, what temperature is the cave, right? It's not room temperature. It's not 70 degrees, right? It's a nice 40, and it's a constant 40 degrees, right? So they shift it up, and they incubate these cultures at just above refrigeration temperatures, right? Just barely. And all of a sudden, there it is, right? They're able to grow it. They look at it under the microscope. They scrape it from the back and look at it. It's the same stuff, right? So ultimately, over the course of numerous studies and over the course of a handful of different researchers that are each looking at this project, they're ultimately able to figure out and pinpoint that the fungus is what's causing these issues, right? It is something that has become a huge problem. The bat populations across the United States are dealing with it. It's not just the East Coast, right? It's spreading. They feel that it's likely a fungus that was brought to America from Europe, from some individuals that were spelunking or, hiking through caves, where they potentially brought it on some of their gear, potentially. That's at least some of the speculation, and brought it here because it does genetically show relatedness to European type of fungus. I think that's interesting. So these guys play huge roles in an ecosystem. They eat massive amounts of insects. For agriculture, they play a huge role. Farmers may or may not recognize the importance of bats, but they play a tremendous role in eating mass quantities of pests, right? And with the demise and decline of their populations, it's linked to bigger issues, more pests, more problems, more pesticides are needed to deal with all of this. And that definitely sets the stage for bigger concerns. It's almost like the frog as an indicator. The bat's kind of a similar situation. This fungus, they recognize very contagious. It's an airborne situation. Bats close to one another tend to get infected just by breathing. Coming in contact with it also sets the stage for it to be readily transmitted, bat to bat or person to person. As far as you know, all of this goes, it seems as if it has no issues with people, but I would still be a little bit concerned with those circumstances. I do know couple, 3 or 4 years back, there was a biologist that was at Craters of the Moon hiking around and saw a handful of bats that had this white nose. They were all dead at the bottom. So I know that we see it around here. As far as how much of it, I don't know that yet, but it's definitely making its way across the US. Okay, where am I at with this? About halfway. I think that's a good stopping point. I want to stop there. I could quickly go through it, but I don't want to. You need your money's worth, right? We will stop here. We'll wrap up this Thursday. Any questions or concerns? Okay, guys, have a great day.